Northern California, late 1960s. The roads were quiet. Young couples often escaped the city lights, parking beside lonely country roads where no one would disturb them. But someone else was out there, someone watching, someone waiting. Within the next 12 months, California would become home to one of the most terrifying serial killers in American history. Unlike most murderers, he didn't hide from the spotlight. He demanded it. He wrote letters to newspapers. He mocked detectives. He challenged cryptographers. He even gave himself a name, the Zodiac, more than 50 years later. Despite thousands of suspects, millions of dollars spent, and decades of investigation, nobody knows who he really was. This is the complete story of the Zodiac Killer. The late 1960s were a period of enormous social change in America. The Vietnam War dominated the headlines. The counterculture movement was reshaping society. Yet for many families living in Northern California, life felt ordinary. Teenagers gathered at diners, young couples drove into the countryside after dark. Small communities trusted one another, few people locked their doors. It was a different era, an era before DNA databases, before surveillance cameras, before mobile phones. When someone disappeared into the night, they often stayed there. No one imagined that a predator was already choosing his victims. December 20th, 1968. Just days before Christmas, 17-year-old David Faraday picked up 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen for their first official date. Friends describe both teenagers as kind, responsible, and well-liked. Like many young couples, they drove to a quiet area on Lake Herman Road, just outside Vallejo, California. It was an isolated lover's lane. There were no houses nearby, only open fields, darkness, and silence. At approximately 11:15 p.m., another vehicle arrived. Whoever was inside parked behind the teenager's car. What happened next lasted less than 2 minutes. Investigators believe the driver ordered both teenagers out of the vehicle. David Faraday was shot at close range in the head. Betty Lou Jensen ran. She never made it far. She was shot multiple times in the back while trying to escape. When police arrived, there were no witnesses, no obvious motive, no robbery, no signs of sexual assault, just two young victims lying in the cold December night. At first, detectives believed it was an isolated double homicide. They had no idea it was only the beginning. Investigators searched tirelessly for answers. They collected shell casings, interviewed local residents, questioned hunters, motorists, and anyone who had traveled Lake Herman Road that night. But the case quickly went cold. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, no clear suspect. Weeks turned into months. Eventually, the murders faded from newspaper headlines. Families grieved. Detectives moved on to newer cases. It seemed that whoever committed the murders had escaped justice. But 7 months later, the killer returned. And this time, he wanted the world to know he existed. On the night of July 4th, 1969, America celebrated Independence Day. Families gathered for barbecues. Fireworks illuminated the night sky. Just outside Vallejo, another young couple searched for privacy. 22-year-old Darlene Farron and 19-year-old Michael Mageau parked their brown Corvair at Blue Rock Springs Park. The location was only a few miles from where David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen had been murdered 7 months earlier. Neither of them knew someone was watching. Shortly before midnight, a vehicle entered the parking lot. It stopped behind the couple. Moments later, it drove away. Michael later believed it was simply a police officer checking the area, but several minutes later, the same vehicle returned. This time, it parked beside them. A man stepped out. He carried a flashlight. For a brief moment, Michael believed it really was a police officer. Then, the stranger suddenly fired multiple shots through the passenger side window. Both occupants were struck. As the attacker turned away, He heard movement inside the vehicle. Michael was still alive. The gunman calmly walked back and fired several more rounds. Then he disappeared into the darkness. Miraculously, both victims survived the initial shooting, but Darlene Ferrin would later die from her injuries at the hospital. Michael Mageau survived and would become the first eyewitness ever to see the killer. Just 40 minutes later, at 12:40 a.m., the Vallejo Police Department received a phone call. The caller spoke calmly, almost emotionless. He said, "I want to report a double murder." He continued, "If you will go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you will find the kids in a brown car." Then, he added something unexpected. "I also killed those kids last year." The line went dead. Police quickly traced the call. It had been made from a public payphone only a few blocks from the police station. The killer had walked there, made his confession, and vanished before officers arrived. For investigators, everything changed. The two attacks were now connected. A serial killer was hunting young couples. 3 weeks later, on August 1st, 3 newspapers received nearly identical handwritten letters. Each envelope contained details only the killer could have known. The letters were sent to the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. Inside, the writer admitted responsibility for both attacks. But that wasn't all. Each letter also included 1/3 of a strange coded message, a cipher. The author demanded that all 3 newspapers print his message on their front pages. If they refused, he threatened to kill again. The media complied. Within hours, the mysterious killer became front-page news across California. Millions of people stared at symbols they couldn't understand. Everyone wondered who had written them. Police cryptographers struggled to solve the message. Days passed. Nothing. Then, a California school teacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty began studying the symbols from home. Using frequency analysis, pattern recognition, and patience, they cracked the code. The message shocked investigators. It began, "I like killing people because it is so much fun." The writer continued by describing murder as better than hunting wild animals. He claimed that victims would become his servants after death. Yet, despite the chilling confession, one thing was missing: his identity. Near the end, the cipher appeared to promise his name. Instead, it ended with meaningless symbols. Whether this was intentional or another unsolved clue remains unknown. Days later, another letter arrived. This one began with 5 words that would become infamous. "This is the Zodiac speaking." For the first time, the killer had given himself a name. Beneath the signature, he drew a strange symbol, a circle crossed by vertical and horizontal lines. It resembled a gun sight, or perhaps a compass. To this day, no one knows exactly why he chose it, but from that moment forward, the unknown murderer was no longer just another killer. He had become the Zodiac. September 27th, 1969. It was a warm Saturday afternoon at Lake Berryessa, a popular recreational area in Napa County. Families fished from the shore, boats drifted across the water, children played nearby. Among the visitors were 2 college students, 20-year-old Brian Hartnell and 22-year-old Cecilia Shepard. The pair spread a blanket on a small hillside overlooking the lake. They talked, relaxed, and enjoyed what seemed like a peaceful afternoon. Nothing about the setting suggested danger, yet someone had already been watching them. Brian later recalled seeing a man emerging from behind nearby trees. At first, he assumed the stranger was a hiker, but something felt wrong. The man wasn't dressed for hiking. He wore dark clothing. A black hood completely covered his face. Large clip-on sunglasses were attached over the eye openings. Across his chest, a white symbol had been carefully stitched onto the fabric, a circle with crossed lines, the same symbol that had appeared beneath the Zodiac's letters. The stranger approached calmly, holding a handgun. He claimed to be an escaped convict. He said he needed money and a vehicle to escape to Mexico. To make his story believable, he produced pre-cut lengths of clothesline. He ordered Cecilia to tie Brian's hands. Then he checked the knots himself. Not satisfied, he tightened them until Brian could barely move. Only then did he tie Cecilia. The couple still believed they were being robbed. They had no idea who stood before them. Without warning, the stranger pulled out a large knife. What happened next lasted only a few minutes. Brian and Cecilia were attacked. The killer never shouted, never appeared angry. Witness accounts described him as calm, methodical, almost detached. Afterward, he simply walked away, leaving both victims where they lay. Brian Hartnell survived. Despite serious injuries, he remained conscious long enough to describe the attack. Cecilia Shepard was transported to hospital. She fought for 2 days, before sadly losing her life. Before leaving, the killer approached Brian Hartnell's car. Using a black felt tip marker, he wrote directly onto the driver's door. The message listed 3 dates: December 20th, 1968, July 4th, 1969, September 27th, 1969. Beside them, he drew the familiar crosshair symbol. The writing effectively confirmed responsibility for the earlier attacks. For investigators, it was the strongest admission yet that all 3 crimes were connected. At 7:40 p.m., the Napa County Sheriff's Office received another call. The voice was calm, emotionless, again. The caller carefully described the crime scene before saying, "I want to report a murder." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "No, a double murder." The caller hung up. Investigators later discovered fingerprints on the telephone, but none could be conclusively matched to a suspect. Once again, the Zodiac had stayed one step ahead. Only 2 weeks later, the Zodiac changed his hunting ground. Instead of targeting isolated lovers' lanes, he entered the heart of San Francisco. On October 11th, 1969, taxi driver Paul Stine picked up a passenger in downtown San Francisco. The destination appeared ordinary, an upscale residential neighborhood. Nothing seemed unusual during the journey, but when the taxi stopped, the passenger suddenly attacked Stine. Nearby residents heard what sounded like a single gunshot. Looking outside, witnesses saw a man leaning into the taxi before calmly walking away. The killer removed a piece of the victim's shirt. It wasn't a random act. It was proof. He planned to send it to the newspapers. One of the most astonishing moments in the entire investigation happened only minutes later. Police dispatch mistakenly broadcast the suspect's description as a black male. As officers searched nearby streets, 2 patrol officers encountered a white man walking away from the crime scene. Believing he couldn't possibly be the suspect, they allowed him to continue. Only later, when dispatch corrected the description, did officers realize what had happened? Many investigators believe this was the closest law enforcement ever came to catching the Zodiac Killer. Had the radio message been accurate, history might have been very different. Just days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter. Inside, investigators found something chilling: a small piece of Paul Stine's blood-stained shirt. Only the killer could have possessed it. The message proved beyond doubt that the Zodiac was still alive, still watching, and still determined to control the narrative. By now, California wasn't simply hunting a murderer. It was chasing a ghost, one who seemed to enjoy staying just out of reach. By the end of 1969, multiple law enforcement agencies were working the case: local police departments, county sheriffs, state investigators, and later, federal agencies. The biggest obstacle was jurisdiction. Each attack had occurred in a different location, different detectives, different evidence, different witnesses. Before modern digital databases, sharing information between departments was slower and more complicated. Investigators interviewed thousands of people. They examined firearms records, compared handwriting samples, collected fingerprints, and followed hundreds of leads. Most ended in dead ends. The Zodiac seemed to leave just enough evidence to keep investigators searching, but never enough to identify him beyond doubt. Over the years, many suspects were investigated. One name surfaced more often than any other: Arthur Lee Allen. Allen lived in Northern California and came to investigators' attention through tips from people who knew him. Some details appeared suspicious. Witnesses claimed he had spoken about hunting people before the Zodiac crimes became widely known. Searches of his property uncovered weapons and other items that investigators considered noteworthy. However, the evidence never became conclusive. Handwriting experts generally did not identify Allen as the author of the Zodiac Letters. Known fingerprints were not considered a match. Later, DNA examinations also failed to definitively connect him to the case. Although many investigators privately believed Allen was a strong suspect, no court ever found evidence sufficient to charge him with the Zodiac murders. The case against him remains heavily debated to this day. Arthur Lee Allen was far from the only suspect. Over the decades, investigators examined dozens of individuals. Some resembled witness descriptions. Others lived near crime scenes. Several became subjects of books, documentaries, and television programs. Yet, one by one, the evidence failed to provide a definitive answer. Some suspects were ruled out through fingerprints, others through timelines. Others simply lacked enough credible evidence. The investigation gradually shifted from proving one person guilty to determining whether the available evidence could ever identify anyone with certainty. As forensic science advanced, investigators revisited the case. Archived fingerprints were scanned using modern technology. Potential DNA was extracted from stamps and envelopes associated with the correspondence attributed to the Zodiac. Experts also re-examined witness statements, ballistic evidence, and crime scene photographs. These efforts eliminated some theories, but they did not conclusively identify the killer. One challenge remains the age and quality of the surviving evidence. Decades of storage, handling, and environmental exposure make modern analysis difficult. Even today, investigators continue to review new tips when credible information emerges. More than half a century has passed. The victims' families have spent decades without complete answers. Detectives who devoted years of their careers to the investigation have retired. Some are no longer alive. Yet the case continues to fascinate investigators, historians, and the public. Not because of the killer's notoriety, but because it represents one of the most challenging unsolved investigations in American history. The Zodiac case also changed policing. It highlighted the need for better communication between agencies, advances in forensic science, and the preservation of evidence for future technologies. Every new development in DNA analysis raises the possibility that even the oldest cold cases may one day be solved. Some mysteries end with an arrest. Others end with a confession. The Zodiac case has neither. It remains an open chapter in criminal history. Whether the truth is eventually uncovered through forensic science, newly discovered evidence, or information that has yet to surface, no one can say. But behind every headline, every investigation, and every theory are real people whose lives were forever changed. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not because of the man who sought attention, but because they remind us why the search for truth never truly ends.